Dr. MIRJANA ROKSANDIC, thanks so much for coming back onto Evolution Soup all the way from your home in Manitoba, Canada. You are a N.S.E.R.C. Canada Research Chair in Human Evolution and Professor of Anthropology at the University of Winnipeg, and your main interests focus upon Pleistocene hominin evolution in Europe, asking the big questions as to when, how, and why humans have moved across the vast expanses of land and sea. Last time we talked about Homo bodoensis, a hominin representing the immediate ancestor of modern humans, but today we'll be visiting an area of Europe that is very dear to your heart, the Balkans, and the incredible fossil cave sites that can be found there. Welcome back, MIRJANA. So, what's been happening with you since you were last on the show?
So I haven't been traveling much because I'm actually, as you see, growing my hair, recovering from cancer treatment. But my team has been doing a lot of work in the Balkans in particular, but also in Africa as well. And we're working on some material from Turkey. So it's been quite busy.
Well, your work takes you all around the world, including places like Cuba and Nicaragua, where you've studied mortuary practices and rituals of the Caribbean. But it's the Balkan area of southeastern Europe where you've made some amazing hominid discoveries, which we'll be discussing today. MIRJANA, can you give us an overview of this area and why it's so significant?
Oh, Balkans is, I mean, if you look at the map, not from the perspective of Europe being in the center of the world, but actually, if you put the map so that you can see the Europe, Asia, and Africa at the same time, you're going to see that the Balkans is kind of centered in between these, or actually at the border of these cross-continental communications. So basically, you have access from Balkans throughout the ice ages. You keep having access to the Balkans from Europe, then through either over the Aegean Sea or over the Black Sea, you have access to Asia and Southwest Asia, and through Southwest Asia, you have access to Africa. So this area, which I have actually called East Mediterranean Communication Area or East Mediterranean Area, Balkan belong to that particular geographic entity, or I don't know if it's entity, but geographic region that actually has so much significance for the movement of any kind of animal, including humans, from Africa to Europe, from Africa to Asia, from Asia into Europe, from Europe back into Asia or possibly Africa. So we are on a shifting plate, kind of, so to speak, like Balkans, as you know from recent history, has actually really great archaeology because things in the Balkans change every 50 years. When I was in Denmark back in 2000, a colleague of mine said, whoever wanted to invade Denmark, it's so far and so cold and so like, dark in the winter and everything. But in the Balkans, these shifts of populations are constant, and they're because it's a crossroads, because it's an important geographic sort of a geopolitical, if you want, area for everyone. And that goes for Eastern Mediterranean. Similarities between Balkan and Lebanon on one hand. When I was in Lebanon, it was just amazing how similar the attitudes were, how similar the history was in some very unexpected ways, if you want, because it's a different population, different something or other, right? So Balkans is important throughout, if you want, human history, deep history included. So because that's where the migrations came through. like they always have to be true. The other aspect of the Balkans that's really important is that actually it's not just a migratory route, it is also a refugial area. Um, in sometimes in 2004, 3003, Hewitt and colleagues and colleagues from Slovenia actually published a book on Balkan as a hotspot of biodiversity. So it's what is really interesting is that 80% of all species that are found in Western Europe and 100% of all species that are found in Eastern Europe originate, repopulate the Eastern and Western Europe, respectively, from the Balkan Peninsula. So, heterofauna, flora, all sorts of things originate from this hotspot of biodiversity. So it's also a very important refugium in the ice ages. So there is, tons of stuff that is really relevant outside of just human habitation, human evolution, that is linked to the Balkans.
The Balkans are known for several dozen cave sites with evidence of hominid occupation spanning the lower, middle, and upper Paleolithic periods. In 2008, you and your team excavated the Mala Balanica cave complex in southeastern Serbia. You expected to find Neanderthal remains, but dug up something quite alarmingly different, isn't that right?
Well, I mean, I derive great pleasure from the fact that it's not a Neanderthal. It's so I'll give you a little bit of a background of the site, and then we can talk about the fossil itself and why it was so important. In fact, when we started working, when my colleague Dusan Mihailovic and Bojana Mihailovic, they actually started going systematically to examine if there is Paleolithic in Serbia. Paleolithic was very poorly known and researched at a time when we were students in Serbia. There was maybe 3 caves that were known from the region. And there were some very important caves in Croatia, like Krapina, for example, which is a very rich Neanderthal site. There were caves in Greece, like Petralona, which has a very interesting, yet undefined, but most likely Neanderthal individual. And then there was Apidima also in Greece, and there were sites, early Upper Paleolithic sites in Romania. So basically, the focus of Balkan archaeology was on all the fancy Greek and Roman and Neolithic and Mesolithic, beautiful, beautiful archaeology that is actually a little bit more easy to recognize and understand, and also which had very long tradition of work in specifically in Serbia. So when my colleagues Dusan and Bojana started working on the Balkans, on the Paleolithic there, very few sites were really known and properly excavated. So in 2000, they began this intensive campaign. And I can tell you that they're still intensively working in both surveying and discovering the sites, but also in excavating. So for the last 25 years, I think Dushan has spent um, on average more than 100 days or 120 days in the field, both in surveys and then in excavations. In 2004, they were surveying the Sičevo Klisura, so Sičevo Gorge. And this is in southern Serbia, not far from the Sičevo village, not far from the city of Niš. Niš is the third biggest city in Serbia. Very interesting place to go to. Excellent food as well, just about everywhere. So what they found was 2 caves that were sort of interconnected. They have the entrances to the caves. So these caves are located basically ideally for human occupation. And this is when you're surveying, trying to find which cave to actually examine and excavate. location is also, real estate, location. Like they really looked for a specific type of caves that had the southern exposure, that were neither too high up, neither too low from the river. So this was about 300 meters from the river, and it was southern exposure, and there were two caves that whose entrances are separated by 7 meters. So it's really easy access. We also believe that maybe they are linked in the back, but the back is so very deep, and we still haven't gotten to the point where we can actually demonstrate that there is a link. But they actually grow into each other, if you want, in the back. So these two caves proved to be, I mean, they worked on them since 2004. Now I think we're closing them this year. Last year was the last excavation season. The caves are called Mala Balanica and Velika Balanica. So basically, lots of caves in Serbia are called Mala or Velika because there are the small Mala or big Velika, right? So you have lots of caves with similar name. So they started excavating in 2004 in both caves, and both caves proved to have substantial Pleistocene, so low kind of small level of Holocene, which is the period in which we live right now, and then the Pleistocene layers that we could actually see were below the Holocene. And these are, you can differentiate them. They're reddish. They look different from the accumulation of kind of a Pleistocene deposits. So in 2004, 2005, they had relatively decent success. They found lots of materials in the upper portion of the Mala Balanica cave, lots of material in the Velika Balanica cave, which also proved to be very, very rich. And then in 2006, when they came to the field, they found a pit dug by the gold diggers. Yeah. And so, or wild cavers, or whatever we call them. I mean, these are people who go in because there's always lore about gold being left in the cave, and people go and dig. This is another huge problem that is happening now because of the period of sanctions and then period of real brutal capitalism now in Serbia, which actually incentivizes people to dig archaeological sites and sell the archaeological objects throughout Western Europe. So it's a tough topic. Anyways, they came, they dug, and they left a bottle of, I don't remember what kind of plastic drink was in there, something like Coca-Cola or something like that. They left it on the bottom of the pit where they stopped digging. Okay. So what Dusan did, he actually went in, got students to straighten the profile, use the the clandestine pit as an excavation unit, right? And so now he actually did all the proper excavations of the remaining sediment that was within the square of what we were working on, and then he straightened the profiles, put this clandestine pit within the normal archaeological grid, right? And then stopped um, at uh, at the level that they have excavated, sort of flattened it out so that we know what is the basis from which we're digging. And 10 centimeters below that dark pit was undisturbed human mandible. So this was the biggest thing that actually happened. And it wasn't recognized as such. This is very gooey, uh, fat kind of soil. So it was just picked up as one of the, you know, fossils, like one of the animals that was in the cave, and put aside for analysis later on once it was actually cleaned. Our colleague from University of Belgrade, Vesna Dimitrijevic. She's a prof at the University of Belgrade. She is paleontologist, and she told Dushan it has teeth and it's human. So, and so Dushan calls me. I was in Winnipeg at the time. It was February. It was very cold here, and Dushan calls me and says, "Well, we have something that is potentially human," and he says it's a mandible and it has teeth. And what do you think? I said, well, if Vesna says that a mandible with teeth looks human, it is a human. So, just let me get organized. I'm coming to Serbia. I'm going to examine it as soon as I come, right? So in 2008, in February, I got my, at that time, Dean of Arts and the president to find some money. There's always some money for exciting things at the university, and they paid my trip to University of Winnipeg, paid my trip to Belgrade, and to visit, to actually look at the site and to examine the mandible. And I cannot tell you how emotional that was. It was pretty amazing, to see a fossil. Like I studied fossils, and it's there's many more fossil researchers than fossils. The mandible itself. So when I looked at it first, I said to Dushan, this looks really primitive. Like it doesn't look anything like it's not a modern human, but it doesn't look like a Neanderthal either. And so I started, obviously, the whole research that goes into comparative morphological analysis, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the important things was that it didn't have any of the telltale signs of a Neanderthal mandible, which is a vast retromolar space, which is the position of the mental foramen, stuff like, that we look for when we are looking at to identify something as Neanderthals in terms of mandible. But mandible, my PhD supervisor, Chris Mickeljohn, when I told him about it, he says, "Oh, the skull is made by God, but the mandible is made by the devil," which obviously it did mean that he believed in creationist movement. And this is just a way of saying, you can recognize lots of good things on the cranium, but variation in the mandibular area is so strong that you have to be very careful about your conclusions. The mandible also had something that is very interesting, and that is like the beginning of it's kind of hard to say because the area was missing, but we had this plateau inside the mandible that is actually, commonly found in Homo erectus and associated or um, uh, kind of appropriate features. So what we did is, before even I went to Belgrade, they scanned the mandible at the University of Belgrade Medical Facility. They did a medical CT scan, which doesn't have a very high resolution, but at the time we didn't have micro CT. And so they sent me immediately those images. I collated them here, made them into 3D model, printed the model, and I was looking into the mandible virtually even before I went to Serbia. And there's lots of things that you could actually see on this virtual model. I mean, this is older than late Pleistocene. It's definitely not modern human. What's your stratigraphic age that you're assigning to it? Because this was found about between meter and a half and two. I don't have exact number here, but it was found very much below the layer with artifacts. And for the layer with artifacts, we knew that they were a Middle Paleolithic and that they looked a very specific kind of Middle Paleolithic that is earlier in Eastern Europe and the Balkans than it is in the West. So, according to Dushan, we were probably looking at something that's older than 250,000 years old. And we thought it was very old for, because there's nothing from that time period. Nothing was ever discovered in the Balkans from Middle Pleistocene. So we got Norbert Mercier to come in. So they shouldn't called him because they worked together in Montenegro. And Mercier came in and he took the mandible to try to do gamma spectroscopy directly on the bone. It was older than 80,000 years old. We thought it was about 250,000 years old. This is the time when we for sure have Neanderthals in in France and Western Europe galore, right? The classical Neanderthals. But it's also at a time when we have Neanderthals and modern humans in Southwest Asia. So having something that's neither modern human nor a Neanderthal at that age would have been really big, right? Like really big news. Finally, it got published, right, in 2011. By that time, we knew that it might actually be. I mean, we always suspected it's older, much older than 80,000 years ago. And I had Fred Smith, the most beautiful human to work with because he's so supportive. He's always very, very kind. His approach is not in your face and everything else. So I invited him to come to Winnipeg, give a talk, and we were looking at the mandible. And he said, "Oh, Mirjana, I think based on the morphology, we have something that's 600,000 years old." And I'm like, okay, morphology doesn't really always cut it with chronology, right? But he was spot on. Like, this is really interesting. So basically, what this mandible fitting with, these finds from that were coming out at the time really did is we proposed that different things are happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, different things are happening in Southwest Europe, and that these things actually, could be looked at the population level. So we are having this development of Neanderthal morphology in Western Europe and movement of Neanderthal morphology towards the east, which I can briefly talk about later. But what we have in Eastern Europe and Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean is probably a population that remained more primitive because it did not have any directional evolutionary change. So these evolutionary changes happen for all sorts of reasons. We talked about that last time. So what happens is that if you have a larger population, that population will retain all the traits that are not detrimental to it, that are not under selective pressure. It will retain all these traits in the population just because they're there. So the retention of primitive traits, and remember, primitive doesn't mean any derogatory, it's just ancestral traits that remained in our construction, such as our face. Our face is actually constructed more primitively than Neanderthal face, and that's where we actually easily recognize Neanderthals. So this is this retention of all these ancestral traits is actually because this population in the Eastern Mediterranean was not isolated. And this also indicated that possibly in Europe, when soprano is looked at, when Arago is looked at, when we look at the different other individuals, in Europe, we might have had two different populations, maybe one that actually was more like the source population, and the other that was really strongly developing Neanderthal morphology, and mostly in that time period, it was in the West. There's lots, of course, debate of how Neanderthal morphology came about, where it came from. There are different scenarios, etc., etc. But this is probably the most parsimonious explanation. Neanderthals develop in the West, then they move east. And we do find them in the East later on.
In 2019, your team announced another discovery, this time in the Pešturina cave, not far from Mala Balanica, containing layers with Neanderthal remains. Briefly, Mirjana, what is the story of the fossils of Pešturina?
In Pešturina, we found a molar that actually had definitely Neanderthal traits. And this was also very interesting because this is the first Neanderthal that we actually did find in Central Balkans, so in Serbia, if you want more specifically. And it's really interesting because after that result, we also found um, in the same year, but not published at the same time, we also found in Velika Balanica, the cave next to Mala Balanica, the Neanderthal remains. And so, what I can tell you about this is really interesting because now we had, at 500,000 years old, we have non identified hominin. At 350,000 years old, we have Velika Balanica Neanderthal, and that at 100 or 90,000 years old, we have Pešturina Neanderthal. Pešturina and Velika Balanica Neanderthal are both upper dentition, and they are both very similar in morphology. It's too picky to detail that, but what is really interesting is that now we have the sequence, of hominin fossils that are in the same region, and we can start building a regional picture. Like, lots of pieces are missing, tons of pieces are missing. Like, you have a 1,000 pieces puzzle, but we have now found 4 or 5 pieces. Like, this is really not a very significant amount of pieces, but we can start building the picture. And also, what's really interesting, that archaeologically, Velika Balanica is a beautifully rich cave, and the material is very much connected. The archaeological material is very much connected to the Eastern Mediterranean proper, so to the sites in Turkey, in Israel. And so this is really important because now you have the archaeological remains, so material culture coming from the East into the Balkans, and you have evidence of Neanderthals coming from the West into the Balkans, and you have a site where you have Neanderthal remains with the culture that's basically Eastern Mediterranean, where we still at that time do not know who produced that culture. So we are going to have to look into, now we're looking into other scenarios and stuff like that. But this Neanderthal movement back from the west towards the east is now, sort of a solidly shown in the record, in the archaeological record. One of the very interesting things about Pešturina is that it has produced the earliest human microbiome. We're hoping to get earlier one from Neanderthals from Velika Balanica, but it's not really working. It's too old. But this one is 100,000 years old, and it actually shows in in the Streptococcus bacteria present in subgroup of Streptococcus bacteria that are actually indicative of processing starchy foods. So microbiome is definitely a Neanderthal microbiome. My colleague Christina Mariner actually, did a huge study on these, and it's easy to recognize Neanderthal from modern human microbiome. Oral microbiome. So now we're looking at the oral microbiome 100,000 years ago that actually looks like it has the ability to process very starchy foods, such as roots, tubers, seeds, that are actually very rich sources of sugar and energy. And so this went counter the inherited logic that Neanderthals consumed large amounts of meat, and that actually the landscape and the behavior of Neanderthals was mostly associated with hunting. We have evidence of processing foods that were considered to become important only with the agriculture. Obviously, this is not the case. So this is a very interesting find. And then we had I will have to give you a picture of that. We have a really good reconstruction of the paleo environment in the vicinity of Pešturina cave. And this was done by Gabriela Morceler from Spain, who actually drew based on the palynological record and pollen analysis from the caves. She had a reconstruction of the surroundings, which really look lush and very vegetable heavy. So, Neanderthals were not eating just meat, and they were not a sort of top carnivore. They were processing quite a lot of starchy foods as well.
Well, it's incredible work that you and your team are doing, Mirjana, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to take the time to come back onto the show today. So, what upcoming projects can you tell us about?
So we're currently, I still have to say Dushan is still spending 180 days in the field in the last 3 or 4 years. It's absolutely insane, but we're finding lots of new caves, starting new excavations. We have extended the research. Basically, what I'm really hoping for is to look for early Pleistocene sites because we want to go deeper in the past because that's really, really interesting question about the movement of hominins from Georgia into Europe. We are currently working with the Turkish colleagues and on some new material. Uh, I can't say yet what it is because it's still not published. And and we're also working on that mandible that was found in the tiles of the floor uh, in France. And so there's lots of work that's going on, lots of grant applications. And Peja and I are now starting to look for fossil primates in Serbia, not necessarily just humans, but much earlier fossil apes. And so a lot is happening, lots more to think about and enjoy.
Mirjana Roksandic, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thanks for having me on your show. It's a great pleasure.